And Jesus said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." And Thomas replied, "My Lord and my God." In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Would you please be seated? Amongst the, sadly, seemingly ever-growing list of my pet peeves, small things that bother me a little, is undoubtedly the label so often stuck onto this morning's gospel passage. Heard every year on this second Sunday of Easter, how often have we all heard this called the story of Doubting Thomas? Doubting Thomas. How unfortunate that the disciple who so often in the gospel narrative is amongst the most zealous and honest should become perennially associated with that unfortunate adjective. How often can Thomas be forgotten as the one who, in John 11, for example, rebukes the other disciples for their fear of suffering at the hands of the religious authorities and urges them to accompany Jesus that we may die with him? Or as the one who, in, I think, John 14, is bold enough to say what surely all the other disciples were thinking and expresses his confusion at one of the Lord's prophecies and says, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way? Were it not for this honest question, perhaps we may never have heard those well-beloved words of Christ said in response, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Doubting Thomas. Well, if so, then perhaps betraying Peter and headstrong James too. Or perhaps better, just retire the title altogether, please. And I say this not only because that moniker fails to do justice to this blessed apostle, whose confession upon seeing the wounds of Christ is arguably one of the greatest contained in the Gospels, but also because for as long as we frame Thomas, indeed frame this whole story with a focus on his actions and words, his temporary unbelief, we may risk missing something far more significant. Because this story is not really about Thomas at all. He's just illustrative. Rather, it seems to me that at its core, this passage gives us one of the most important, one of the most beautiful, one of the most arresting revelations of who God is, who God chooses to be, and how this risen Lord is known by his people. Let me unpack that just for a second. Go back, if you will, to the very beginning of this passage where the scene is set. We encounter the disciples, bar Thomas, gathered together just days after the crucifixion in a locked room. Barely 72 hours before, their Lord and Master, the teacher whom they hailed as the long-expected Messiah, had been betrayed, arrested, tortured, and publicly and violently executed as a common criminal. And for all they knew, any one of them could be next. To top it off, Jesus' body had somehow disappeared from the tomb, and they didn't quite know how or where or what was going on. Confused and frightened, they barricade themselves in a house, lock the doors, and hide. And all of this, at one level, really quite understandably. Now, of course, we know what happens next, don't we? Jesus suddenly appears, there in their midst, and stands alongside them. Stands alongside them. Far from calling them out, or indeed waiting for them to find him, he goes to where they are. He goes into that place of fear and confusion, and for a moment simply stands with them. He returns to those with whom he'd walked for 3 years. He returns to these, his brothers, with whom he had been closest. He returns, indeed, to those who had just a few hours earlier deserted him in the garden. And for a moment, simply stands with them. I wonder how many of us here in times of particular dark, particular despair, grief, anxiety, have been the recipient of that best kind of pastoral care. The one that doesn't try to fix your problems for you. The one that doesn't try to put words in your mouth and say, oh, don't worry, it's not a big deal, it'll all be over soon. But the person who just comes and is with you. Here the Lord comes and stands alongside them. And then, into their moment of deepest dark, declares, peace be with you. My peace, as Jesus would have said, my shalom is with you. Now, for as shocking an experience as that must have been, surely this is the moment of the disciples' great rejoicing, right? Suddenly, the prophecies that he'd been telling them for at least 3 years have come true. There he is, alive after his crucifixion, standing in their midst, pronouncing peace and not wrath. Surely, there is no better moment than this for them to have rejoiced. And, if I were asked to recite this story from memory, I'd probably remember this as the sequence of events. Jesus comes, says, peace be with you, and then they do just that, rejoice in seeing their Lord. I mean, that's the natural place for it, right? But did you notice that passing detail, that passing yet oh so important detail in the narrative? Let me read it again. Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. After this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. Note the point at which they rejoice. Note the point at which they recognize Jesus. For it's not when he appears in the locked room and stands among them. It's not even when he speaks and pronounces his peace. No. The disciples see the Lord, see him in the fullest sense of the word, when he shows them his hands and his side. It is by the wounds of his passion that he becomes known. Now, these men had been by Jesus' side for at least 3 years. They'd spent more time with him than almost anyone else. They knew him better than almost anyone else. And yet, when he stands with them, they do not know him. When he speaks to them, they do not know him. Only when he shows them his scars. Only when he holds open to them the marks of the cross do they know him. It is then, St. John tells us, that they rejoice. And it's here, it seems to me, that we find the crux of this story. That in his resurrected, and as we'll celebrate in a few weeks, ascended body, the Lord of creation chooses to become known by his wounds. It can be easy, I think, at times in our Easter reflections, to slip into that place of thinking that the resurrection was Jesus returning to normal, that his death and descent into hell was an unfortunate blip that the resurrection replaces. In essence, that he is unchanged by his passion. In many ways, this is perhaps a more comfortable idea. Death is rarely a pleasant thing to ponder. And how often do we think that the best victories are those where the victor emerges untouched? And yet, this passage points us to a reality quite different. For the God we find here is far from the one who has left the reality of the cross behind, moved past and covered over that dark place by the resurrection. On the contrary, the God revealed here is the one who, in his triumph, in his glorious, perfect, resurrected body, the body that indeed right here and right now sits on the throne of heaven, chooses to forever bear on himself the marks of the cross, chooses to carry in himself the wounds which were the price of love. Indeed, chooses not only to bear them, but to make himself known by them. And all this because the God revealed in the risen Christ is the one who upon the cross turns the world on its head, so that that which by rights should be the marks of humiliation, defeat, and weakness become in that saving and creating work the proud, joyful, and eternal signs of the love that is relentless and knows no limit. That which was inflicted by humanity upon the very body of God is here, he here does not disregard, but glorifies, holding them not as signs of our guilt, not as an attempt to forever make us feel in ourselves that weight of sin, but rather to take that and carry it upon himself, glorified, that he may forever bear in himself those marks of the new covenant, which upon the cross was opened to you and to me. In the risen Christ, those paradoxical signs of God's triumph, a triumph which places us squarely at its center, become by his free choice the hallmarks of his divine body. They become eternally the signs by which he may be recognized. There's a really rather lovely account in some of the writings of the church. Some of you may have heard of one of the great theologians of the church, a Spanish mystic called Teresa of Avila. Later in life, she writes this beautiful account of some of her experiences and records at one point of a remarkable encounter she had. She records that one day as she's walking through the cloisters of the convent, suddenly there stands before her the figure of the risen Christ. And he stands there and holds his arms out and says, "Teresa, it is I." And she stops and looks him up and down and then just keeps on walking. And after a second, he goes, hold on, and runs after her and says, "Teresa, peace be with you. It is I." Once more, she sort of looks him up and down, she writes, and turns and walks in the other direction. And so the third time, this figure of the risen Christ chases after her and stops her and says, "Teresa, it is I, the one for whom you have been praying and looking and longing and devoting yourself your entire life. Here I stand before you, and yet you turn your back." And without missing a beat, she looks him up and down and replies, "Begone, Satan." And as she writes, in that instant, the figure standing before her transforms. And there, standing, is the devil, who says, "Tell me, how on earth did you know it was me?" And I'd like to think rather mockingly, she replies, "Because you don't bear his wounds." And indeed he does not. For his pride cannot even imitate the sign of his defeat. It is by his wounds that he chooses to be known. Brothers and sisters, it seems to me that in this encounter between the risen Christ and his disciples, we catch a glimpse of what it is to speak of God as the great spiritual writer Henry Nouwen once termed it, as the wounded healer. The wounded healer. Now, to say this does not, indeed cannot, mean that the God who emerges victorious from the grave is any lesser because of his scars, as if they continue to wound and pain him. Not at all. Rather, it is to speak of the God whose desire to stand in solidarity with his people, even in the midst of our weakness, is perpetual. It is to speak of the God who carries, even in his resurrection, even in his ascension, the wounds inflicted by human life, that we who likewise walk in this life with wounds may find in him the one who does not disregard them or treat them as unimportant, the one who does not seek to cover over them and simply say, forget about that, all will be well in the end, but the one who indeed knows what it is for the wounds of human life to be formative, the one who knows what it is for the wounds of human life to, in one way or another, make us who we are. Seen in the risen Christ, there in that upper room, is the God who knows what it is to hold that and indeed to honor that. And honor that with the promise that these wounds which in this life every one of us will encounter at some time or another are not done away with in the life that is to come, because indeed they are formative, but rather are glorified, not papered over, but like the wounds which he sustained on the cross, are turned on their head, that they may indeed become the signs of triumph and glory. This is the promise which the risen Christ holds before his people in that moment. The promise of the wounded healer who knows what it is to stand with his people in the midst of their wounds. And yet, as is so often the case with Christ, it is not enough for him simply to show himself to us. For we know the God who desires a far greater degree of intimacy. It is not enough for him to stand far off and invite us simply to behold, but rather, through the opportunity for revelation and intimacy that he created out of Thomas's temporary unbelief, he goes so much further and invites us not only to look at those wounds, indeed, not only just to touch them, but to stick our hands in them, to be enveloped and enfolded by them, to be encompassed in that which bears most solemn and triumphant witness to the love that was his passion. Remember that line from the wonderful hymn, "Deep in thy wounds, Lord, hide and shelter me, so shall I never, never part from thee." It is this that we are invited to do, this that the risen Christ comes to do with his disciples, speaking into that place of deepest dark, speaking into that place of fear and confusion, speaking just his peace, and opening up his wounds with the invitation that we who likewise bear wounds in this life may find in that cleft in the rock the shelter, the haven, the hiding place, which he forever holds open. Allow the wounded healer, who promises not a covering over, but an honoring and a glorifying and a promise of fullness with wounds, to stand by you, as indeed he stood by these first ones. May we find in him the hope of the world, where even our deepest wounds become the signs of grace and glory.